A note to our listeners, the following segment of Education in Focus includes a discussion about sexually explicit material that's available in school libraries. Content might not be appropriate for all audiences. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes Chalkboard. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. Joining me again today is Brendan Clary, Chalkboard's K-12 editor. What age-appropriate books should be available to children in our school libraries has been a topic of much debate, for more than a year now. Parents across the country have protested certain books that depict sexual activity and other explicit content. But it seems now that the U.S. Department of Education, at least some people who work for the Department of Education, are doubling down on a threat to withhold funding from schools that censor certain books. We are recording this on Wednesday, July 19th. So on July 18th, you covered a hearing where this topic was brought up. And there was one in particular Department of Education official said she would withhold federal taxpayer dollars from schools that pull certain books off their shelves. Tell us what's going on here.
Yeah, so it was during a conference on sort of inclusivity and faith and inclusion and how to, for the Education Department's Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And somebody asked the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Civil Rights, her name is Catherine Lhamon. They asked her about book bans. What is the Education Department going to do about book bans? And she replied that her office is, quote, very eager to enforce its control over federal funds to basically make sure that school districts are not creating what they call hostile environments for students based on the removal of books. And this was sort of preempted earlier this year in March, I believe, that a school district in Georgia entered into maybe it was May, they entered into what's called a consent agreement, I believe, where they basically say, like, we're going to work with the feds so that we don't get in trouble after an investigation by the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights that found that the school district's book removal screening process may have created a hostile environment for students. And so that was, I covered that at the time. It was sort of an interesting story then, just because of how they were able to sort of say this book removal process, while it wasn't directly targeting content about protected student status, it wasn't talking about sexuality or religion, and it was they were targeting books that were sexually explicit. That was sort of their aim all the way through. And they admit that the Office of Civil Rights said, hey, we know that they were targeting these books. They were looking for books with sexually explicit content. They said that the way that they did it may have created a hostile environment based on some student comments at a school board meeting. So essentially, some students got up and said, hey, this makes me feel like, this is a discriminatory environment. And based off of those comments from students, the Office of Civil Rights, made this school district enter into a consent agreement and basically told them that, they'd have to do some school climate surveys and that they would have to do some of these other things to sort of remediate or to correct their potentially hostile. They also had to direct students toward, let them know how to file a Title IX complaint. So it's just an interesting sort of thing where they're kind of stepping into these situations and saying this might create a hostile environment. We can do some investigating. And so that was sort of the background of this comment from Lhamon, who said yesterday, basically put it all out on the table, that if you're going to create a hostile environment as we define it, then we can go after you and go into a school district and talk to the community and hear what students are saying, what teachers are saying, and they'll look around. And if they deem that it's a hostile environment, they can try to figure out a way to resolve that. And if they can't, then they'll pull federal funds.
This is a massive, school libraries, like everything else, or not like everything else, but school libraries, like schools, are reliant on taxpayer dollars. So that's a significant threat to schools. Let's talk about this term that she used, hostile environment, a little bit. Parents who don't want their younger children, let's just say we're talking about elementary school age children and leave the high school crowd out of it now. Many parents have concerns about sexually explicit content being available to their first grade student, their second grade student, their third grade student, etc. And we've seen these protests in school board meetings across the country where parents show up. We'll talk about one book in particular, but it's not just one book. It's many, many, many books that are being challenged across the country. That they don't want that sexually explicit material in front of their first grader, for example. The fact that the material is there in the first place has created a hostile environment, I think, for some, particularly those parents who don't think their first grade son or daughter should be exposed to such sexually explicit content. And I guess that's going to lead me to my next comment. Let's talk about one book in particular. Again, this is not the only book. This seems to be the one that's brought up in many of these conversations, and that's a book called Gender Queer. Prior to your story off this coverage of yesterday, we wrote at Chalkboard News about this book. Bridge, Michigan, a nonprofit news site, described Gender Queer in this manner on March 20th of this year. The book tells a story of how the author came to terms as a teen with their sexual identity, the difficulties of coming out as non-binary to family and friends, and navigating issues of sexuality. Certainly seems appropriate by that description alone. Now, maybe for high schoolers, maybe, depending on your parenting, the background you come from, maybe not so for kindergartners, first graders or not, but that's a subjective opinion. Certainly older students, older kids, that by that description, that to me as a parent, I guess I'm just speaking as a parent myself, that would seem age appropriate if the child is confused, looking for other information about things like that. But then when you look at some more explicit descriptions of the book Gender Queer, the Iowa Standard published images of the graphic novel's illustrations that show the main character with blood on his legs and underwear from a period, a blood-covered tampon, a toy vibrator that led to, quote, my first orgasm, and 2 illustrations of young people engaged in oral sex. But that is how one outlet described some of the explicit natures of this book. And I would think you'd want parents to be involved in that one. So, I mean, I'm babbling on here, Brendan. Help me pull this together, and what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, I think that, that you're right that parents have been vocal about this book and others. But specifically, I mean, this one has been challenged the most. The American Library Association said earlier this year that it was the most challenged book for the second year in a row. So in 2022, they released it. It was the most challenged book. And we know that challenges are on the rise. There's other advocacy groups that have said that, that organizations are targeting different titles. And, they're seeing it from a negative point of view that, people should be able to read whatever they want. But I think that the argument from parental groups and parents at board meetings is, I don't want my kid being able to read this in a school library. And they point to some of the sexually explicit content. But on the other side, you have, advocates of those books and, sort of this free speech sort of argument of like, we should be able to have kids reading whatever they want. But you also have people saying, and if we start restricting, LGBTQIA titles, then those students who identify as those sexual minorities won't be able to have literature that reflects them. And so, you're erasing them and you're sort of minimizing who they are.
And, I do get that argument. But when you're talking about the graphic nature of some of the sexuality that's depicted.
Yeah. And, so there are these concerns on both sides that this is a problem. But, that's kind of where the back and forth is sort of happening, I think, is that you have the one side saying that I don't want my kids to read this, and then other people saying, well, you can't decide what every other child is going to read.
And I get that too.
Yeah, and so I think that's sort of the crux of the issue. But then we have the feds like the federal department, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights coming in and saying that if you create a hostile environment, we're sort of taking away that local control of should we ban this or not? So, I think that's something that, the way that our nation works in terms of, we have different school boards that decide the rules for, the library in Iowa versus in California or Portland. There could be differences of opinion. And so that's sort of coming in and saying, look, if you create a hostile environment, then, we're going to go through this and go through these to a Georgia school, earlier this year and saying, like, I know you guys you said you were targeting sexually explicit content, but the fact that some students, basically had felt impacted by the environment surrounding the removal of books. It's sort of a, like, if students feel excluded or like that they're in this environment where they might feel excluded, then the Department of Education saying that that's enough. We can go off of that, and that's our purview, and we can start making, we can insert ourselves into the conversation and basically say, you can't do this, or we'll remove your federal funding. And, the comments from yesterday, Assistant Secretary Catherine Lhamon has, said, I'm happy to use this. We're eager to use it.
I guess just these, I don't know. I'm questioning the blanket federal policy of deciding such issues for everyone. It's not being made a local issue. I should state, too, that there's precedent for this already in Illinois. The state of Illinois, the legislature this year and just this summer, Governor J.B. Pritzker, Illinois is my home state, Pritzker here signed into law a mandate that no state taxpayer funds can go to school districts that remove these types of books from the shelves. We could talk about this issue as ad nauseum, and I'm sure we will plenty as the year plays out, the new school year begins, etc. But we are out of time. This is a conversation that parents should be involved in with their schools, with their school boards, with their children, just to be aware, even if it's just an awareness issue. Of course, our listeners can learn more and follow our ongoing coverage of this story at chalkboardnews.com. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe.